Hello and welcome to End-of-Life University. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt, and for this interview, I'm welcoming my guest, Merilynne Rush, a retired nurse and home birth midwife. She received her nursing degree at the University of Michigan, and during her 25 years of professional life, has been helping people make empowering choices concerning their health care. She has also worked as a hospice nurse, caring for the dying person and the family, and she has witnessed the benefit of walking through rather than around profound emotion. Currently, Merilynne works as a consultant to families seeking alternatives for saying goodbye to their loved ones, specifically home funerals and green burials. She is on the board of directors of the National Home Funeral Alliance, a nationwide network of those advocating for personal choice in caring for their own dead. Hello, Merilynne, and thank you so much for being with us today for this interview.
Thank you so much for having me, Karen. It's an honor to be with you.
Well, I'm really excited to hear what you have to share with us today because the work you do, in my experience, is very unique, and I think this is information that's so important that our listeners will really want to know about. And I'm curious to begin with, Merilynne, how did you get interested in working in this area as a home funeral and natural burial consultant?
As a midwife, most of my work was very joyful and centered around welcoming new life, but as everyone knows, not all pregnancies and births turn out that way, and so I also had the job of comforting families when there was a loss. And during that process, I learned so much from the families that I worked with. It wasn't much of a stretch when it was time for me to retire from being a home birth midwife to turn to want to helping families at the end of life with that transition.
Mm-hmm. I can agree with you. Those two events, birth and death, are so sacred and in some ways mysterious, but very similar in many ways. Just the profound emotion that's present and the beauty that's present for both of those transitions in life. I can see why you in some ways felt called to each one.
Well, there's also a similarity in that in our culture at this time, we've turned away from embracing those events in a natural way at home. Mm-hmm. And many people have learned about home birth through the rise of that movement over the last generation or so. And now, similarly, many baby boomers especially are interested in becoming more connected to death by caring for their own dead at home rather than turning that experience over to someone else.
Mm-hmm. And Merilynne, I had the experience of losing my own mother in January of this year, and because I'm involved in hospice, and she had always expressed a wish to die at home and have me be there taking care of her, which did happen. I was there with her for the last days of her life and took care of her. And what I found, to my surprise, because I've been a hospice doctor, but I haven't actually been part of the after-death experience very often in the home. And so being there with my own mom, the nurse came and we bathed her and dressed her, and those hours after she passed away were some of the most precious and beautiful for me. I sat with her and held her hand, and it was amazing, the stillness and calm and peace that I felt. And so I see what you mean, that can be a very cherished time to have with a loved one. And I felt sad when it was time for the funeral home to come and take her body away. And
what most people don't know is that you don't have to hurry into that action right away. So most of my work is raising awareness and giving people permission, because they just don't know that they can do it, to sit with the body for longer than just a few hours.
Mm-hmm. And I do understand that for some religious traditions, it's normal to keep the body a longer period of time. Is that correct?
Really, historically, in most religions worldwide, there's a deep reverence for that time right after death. and there's many rituals about caring for how to care for the body. In modern days, we've kind of gotten away from that in most of our religions, but not all of them. And around the world, I think it's still very common for that care to take place at the home. So what we're really doing is reviving that sense of empowerment to be able to do that and bringing that tradition back to more people.
Mm-hmm. And so really, it's not creating something new, it's returning to what has been traditional for centuries for people and how they took care of their own dead.
Exactly. We're just relearning what we've forgotten culturally.
Mm-hmm. So could you describe for me what might happen during a home funeral if, say, if I were to have kept my mom at home and what might have happened next at the point where the funeral home stepped in? Had I kept her at home longer, what typically occurs in those situations?
In most of the situations the families that I've been with, had the privilege to accompany during that time, their family member has died at home in hospice care. And so when the death occurs, they notify the hospice agency, and the nurse comes and certifies the death. And it's usually the nurse's obligation to contact a funeral director if there's going to be one, or to know who is acting as the agent for doing all the paperwork. In Michigan, the state that I live in, you do have to work with the funeral director. So that funeral director is contacted, but they're made aware that the family is going to keep the body at home for a number of hours or days. So then after that, all of that official stuff is done, and the family can just be with their loved one and wash the body and dress the body and adorn the body and lay them out either on the bed or in the living room on the couch or on a massage table in front of a picture window or whatever they decide to do if there's going to be a visitation. And then they cool the body using dry ice, which goes underneath, and you don't see it, and it doesn't vaporize or anything, and you don't even know it's there, and that keeps the body safely for a number of days. Then the family gathers together, and they usually share stories and have a time of visitation in the comfort of their own home and do whatever comes naturally to them and traditionally in their family, how they handle celebrations. Some families choose to have an actual funeral. Some families have a gathering of some sort, but they don't actually call it a funeral service. It's not exactly a religious service. And some families just have a time of just being with the body, coming and going, and inviting people to share in that time with them. It's up to them, and they can decide what gives them the most meaning. So
some families might have a visitation such as might occur at a funeral home, but just at home, and advertise that there for certain hours people can come and call on the family.
Right. I had a family who had about 200 people come through their home in the course of an afternoon during the visitation time. And I've had other families who just had a gathering of 8 or 10 people, and some with just 3 or 4 family members.
So do some families choose then to have, say, a memorial service at a separate location also if their home isn't large enough to hold a large group of people?
That's also possible. It's important to know that most funeral homes will not allow a public visitation with an open casket or viewing without embalming. So they may need to find another location, an alternative location. And I had a family that lost a daughter that took the body to the church and had the viewing and the visitation there and had a funeral mass, and then proceeded to the burial.
So embalming is not required, is not a legal necessity?
No, it's not. It's very rarely required and only in very unusual circumstances, and that's probably the single most thing that's most misleading for people.
Yes, because I wasn't aware of that, and so that's good information to have. So really there are a lot of options available to families then to consider after the death has occurred. But it seems
right,
like
but if you know that you want to have a large gathering and the body is not embalmed and you want people to be able to see the body, then really your best choice is to have a home funeral because, like I said, most funeral homes will not allow public visitation with an unembalmed body.
Okay. So that's very good to know. And it does seem like these are all choices that would best be made a little bit ahead of time if families have a chance to meet and even talk with their loved one about what they might prefer.
Right, and it's very important. It's very important to know what is common practice and what is actual law. In the state that I live in, which is one of the most restrictive states, the only two laws are that a funeral director must sign the death certificate and the transit permit to final disposition. And those are registered with the county. It's not a law to embalm that you have to embalm. It's a funeral home guideline. It's not a law that the funeral director has to bring the body home from the hospital if someone dies in the hospital. It's a hospital regulation. So it's helpful to really educate yourself, and there's lots of resources out there for you to be able to do that so that when you are asking these questions and you are seeking alternatives and deciding what you want to do with your family, you know what's possible. I highly recommend that families don't wait to talk about this. If this is something that appeals to them, get your family together or at least write down your wishes and offer to get together with them to talk it all over so people can ask questions and get some clarity and get the help that they need in terms of understanding what's possible and what they want to do. Families can do this entirely on their own if they have the knowledge and the organization ahead of time. It becomes very difficult if they're not prepared. There are still people that you can call in the moment, but your choices are more limited.
And so in your role as a consultant, do you then meet with families ahead of time in advance and provide them with this information and kind of help walk them through the choices and options they might have?
I do. I get a lot of phone calls. I get a lot of emails. I try to make myself available to help people in the moment, but what I prefer is if people contact me ahead of time and we can sit down together with the family and go over everything all together.
And then I was interested in asking you about cremation because do some families choose to have the home visitation and then have cremation later, at a later time?
Well, there's really two choices for the after-death care. There's what are you going to do immediately after the death, for visitation or funeral or honoring the dead or whatever, and then what are you going to do for the disposition? Mm-hmm. So the disposition, and you can have a home funeral and then have a burial or a cremation. You can have a cremation without having had any type of funeral at all and then have a memorial service later or do nothing. So it's really helpful if you divide that up into funeral arrangements and then disposition or burial or cremation arrangements, which you want. So
two separate decisions, really, that need to be made.
Right. And a lot of times people will approach me and say they want to have a green funeral. And so we spend some time talking about what that means to them and what their different choices are.
Would you explain more about that, too, about what does that really mean, a green funeral?
Well, green funeral really is a misnomer. It's kind of the word that people recognize because it's more known out there. They may have heard of, green is a word that's used a lot right now to mean environmentally friendly. So somewhere in the media they've picked up the idea that a lot of our current conventional funeral and burial practices aren't very environmentally friendly. So that appeals to them to do something different that's more environmentally friendly. But as you mentioned, the common misconception is that cremation is the least damaging option. And what most people don't know is that it uses just about as much fuel to drive across the country in a small car as it does to cremate one body.
Wow.
So
I had no idea.
Yeah, you have to have a really high heat for a number of hours. So when people find that out, they start to think, well, maybe cremation isn't the most environmentally friendly option. I mean, it depends on if you value more oil or land. What's more of a commodity in your area. But if you live on an island, green burial might not be the best option if there's not much space available. So green burial itself is also something that's, misunderstood a lot because it does not have one definition either. But essentially what it means is putting the body in the ground in a biodegradable container and without a cement vault so that the body can go back to the earth. So there's the idea that, it's earth to earth, basically. You're going to biodegrade. And that is actually what gives a lot of people comfort, to know that they're going back to the earth.
Yes, I can see that. And so, is there a problem for if someone wanted to have a green burial? Is there a problem with embalming because of the chemicals used in embalming?
So cemeteries that do that kind of burial without a cement vault and allowing alternative containers such as a wicker basket or a shroud have different guidelines for what they'll allow. Some will allow an embalmed body to be buried that way, and some say no, in the green burial section, no embalming, no casket, no cement vault, no marker, nothing that's not going to, just go back to the earth. I mean, you have about a dozen or so cemeteries across the country that are purely dedicated to only green burial, and they're like a prairie. So there's no markers, and there's pathways through there, and you can mow a path for the actual burial. All of the plots are gridded out, and you know exactly where all the bodies are buried, but it looks like a prairie. It doesn't look like what we think of as a conventional, cemetery with gravestones and that kind of thing. And then there's everything in between. You have some cemeteries that are conventional cemeteries. They have a small back section where they do burial without a cement vault. The big issue for cemeteries is cement vault is not a legal requirement. But for most cemeteries, the way they're currently doing their ground maintenance, they need it because you can't drive heavy equipment over graves that aren't protected with cement. You'll have, sudden sinking at some point as decomposition takes place. So it's more of a issue of them changing their ground maintenance practices and burial equipment practices than anything else. People think that there's a problem with water drainage or animals or something like that. None of that's a problem. It's more just for the convenience of the cemetery.
That's so interesting. So it's clear then that there are many, many different possibilities and options, but it varies from state to state based on the laws of the state, and varies from cemetery to cemetery as well.
It definitely varies from cemetery to cemetery and funeral home to funeral home, and somewhat from state to state. But most states are pretty similar on the burial guidelines. And it's also possible to bury on your own property. Again, most states you have to plan ahead to be able to do that. I taught a workshop in Montana last year and found out that because of the wide open spaces and all the ranchers and everything, you can bury somebody on your own property and then register it later. You don't have to do it ahead of time. In Michigan, you sure do have to let the county know ahead of time and have it all deeded off and properly registered with the county where you're planning to bury a body on your own property.
Wow, that's really fascinating to me, because I just had no idea. I didn't even know that there were green cemeteries available where people could be buried without a vault, and that's really fascinating to me, because I personally find that very appealing and comforting, that idea.
Yeah. I mean, I get invited to do a lot of presentations, and that's one of the other biggest parts of my job, in addition to networking and consultation, is education. And I've never been with a group of people who says, "Oh, this sounds like a bad idea." Maybe somebody personally says, "Well, I don't want that for me," but I think it should be a choice that's available to other people. But the problem is, it's daunting to get ready for it all. And it's in most families, if your family's anything like mine, you start talking about death and they don't want to do it. So my sister lives in a Sustainable Institute co-housing community in Vermont, and they're all 100% for it, but they haven't done anything yet to plan it. And when it does happen, if they haven't planned, they're going to have to go with the best option that's available of the conventional options that are out there. So it's a real disconnect between talking about it and actually doing it for most people. I really commend those people who've thought about it ahead of time, talked to their families, planned out how it's going to go, and made their arrangements, and sort of gotten that all taken care of ahead of time.
I can see why it takes some planning, too, because at least my experience when I've seen patients die in the hospital and then even with my mom dying at home, the whole process of after-death care, it seems very mechanized. Everyone has their protocol and they know what to do and who to call and who comes when. And for me, at the time of my mom's death, I was a bit numb and not thinking that clearly in the moment, and all these things were happening without me being aware enough to say, wait, stop. Don't let this process take out. Let's do it differently. At that moment, there was no way that I could have changed anything because I just wasn't fully able to, in the moment to make the choice.
And you're potentially sleep deprived, and I want to share a story with you, Karen. My mother-in-law passed away 2 weeks ago. And my husband and I had not talked very much about the after-death care. She had made her pre-arrangements and chosen her funeral home and her cemetery and everything. But my husband was able to spend 3 to 4 hours with her after she died, and he looks back on it now and feels like that was some of the most precious time, and the processing that he was able to do being with her at that time was invaluable. And I have to say from experience that most people are very fearful of that ahead of time because of all of the misconceptions that we have and the misinformation that we have and the media images that we have, because we haven't spread the word that can be a very healing and healthy thing to do. There's a lot of fear around it. So he thanked me for accompanying him and being able to help him to do that. And I just want everybody to be able to have that and to know that. So we have our work cut out for us to talk to others and let them know that like you're doing, that can be a real special time. Even if it's not a complete home funeral, that lasts for several days or whatever, even just to have a few hours is very special.
Yes, and so we really do have to be intentional about it. We really have to know ahead of time that this is what we want and make sure that we communicate that to other people. Or, as I found, the hospice nurse was there. She called the funeral home. They sent someone over. It all happened so quickly because it's a system. Then it functions that way. It's just the system plays out the way it's designed to. And
then you end up feeling bad because someone else is standing there waiting to do their job. We don't want to keep them waiting.
Yes, exactly. And here we're talking about really disrupting a system and trying to operate in a different way, and that really does take planning ahead of time and awareness. And so that's really the importance behind this conversation that we're having, is just to let people know what the options are out there, that it doesn't have to be your loved one's after-death process doesn't just have to follow the same path that's already been laid out. You can make, there are a lot of different choices you can make, and that's very reassuring to me. And given the baby boom generation, I think that's one of our hallmarks, as I'm a baby boomer too, is that we want choices and we want to be independent and make our own choices for how things will be. So it seems to me like we're the perfect generation to start exploring these options.
I think we're the generation that's going to change things so that for the next generations it will be in place. It will no longer be traditional to have what we now call a traditional funeral.
Yes. Well, how, in your experience, how have funeral directors responded, especially when they have to be involved and have to sign the paperwork? What has their response been?
I haven't had any negative responses from funeral directors that the families that I've accompanied have contacted. They've they've told the funeral director after the death when they called them what they wanted to do, and they said, we have some knowledge about how to do this, and we'd like you to, we'll call you when we're ready, and they've gotten cooperation, so it's worked out beautifully.
Is the funeral director still involved in the burial? Do they still take part in that process, or is it done?
The funeral director has to sign 2 pieces of paper, the death certificate, like I mentioned, in Michigan. This is true in about 9 states, and the transit permit for final disposition. Most funeral directors interpret that to mean that they have to do the transportation. However, there are some funeral directors that say, well, and I'll witness it. You can do the transportation. I'll witness it and I'll sign it. So they're comfortable with that. It's something that we're working on turning around in terms of raising awareness about all the options and building bridges and making connections and letting other funeral directors know that they can do this.
So it does make sense if I were interested, I and a loved one were interested in having a home funeral and a green burial, we would need to do some footwork in our own state just to find out the laws, find out where cemeteries are, where green burial is possible. And
there's a couple of great resources I'd like to mention. One is the National Home Funeral Alliance, and their website is homefuneralalliance.org, and they have wonderful resource and education pages. And we also have an upcoming conference, October 18 to 20 in Raleigh, North Carolina, where we will be talking about home funeral and also touring a green cemetery. And then another resource is the Green Burial Council, and they're an excellent resource for learning about funeral directors and cemeteries all over the country that are open to these alternative practices and also listing of green cemeteries. And then there's also the Home Funeral Directory, which lists people like myself who call themselves home funeral guides or educators all over the country who talk to families, consult with them, are possibly available at the time of death to consult on the phone or whatever, and to educate them ahead of time. I'd also like to mention Crossings, the Crossings organization, Caring for Our Own Dead, that has an excellent handbook that can be downloaded right from their website that gives you step-by-step instructions on how to do this.
Oh, that's
There's many more out there, and the links are all on the homefuneralalliance.org website.
That's great to know, and I will make sure I put all of these. I'm creating, I have a workbook for the interview series, and so all of those references will be made available through that workbook too, so that people can have those. So it sounds like it's possible if you don't decide until the moment of death, if suddenly something clicks and you think, oh, we need home visitation, we need a green funeral, and you haven't planned ahead, it may be possible to actually do something at the last minute, but you might need the help of a consultant like you just to talk you through the process really quickly to make sure you don't leave any steps out that need to be taken care of.
You need to have convergence among the family members, too, so that they are in agreement together and they agree what they want to do. And with that knowledge, that's what you want to do, finding some information about it can happen in the spur of the moment, and there are resources out there, and it's much more difficult, however. And I have to say, it's less likely to happen.
I can
specifically for that family preparation reason. I actually did have a family call me once or twice, actually, when the death had occurred and they hadn't talked about it ahead of time, and somebody came into the situation who knew about the home funeral option and called me, and the first thing I said to her was talk to the family and make sure this is what everybody wants to do. And she called me back and she said, we don't have agreement, so we're not going to be able to do it.
I'm sure that is definitely one of the sticking points for families, is getting everyone in the family who has, an interest and a concern on the same page, to get everyone to agree.
And it's also one of the things that can be the most beautiful for a family. I've sat down with families where the whole table has been filled with people, family members, siblings, children, in-laws, and even somebody on the phone in the middle of the table, listening on the phone. And I've seen the family come together and be able to talk about all this. So it's also a beautiful opportunity for family, growth.
Yes. Is that something, do you help facilitate those conversations for the family?
I do, yeah.
Because that seems extremely valuable, having someone with your knowledge and experience to come together and just keep everyone calm and provide factual information to everyone so that they can make a reasonable decision together.
Right, and to remind them there's no one right way to do this, that the answer is amongst them and it's only a matter of discovering it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this is just a beautiful trend, which it seems to me, is it something fairly new, green burial and home funerals, or have people been doing this all along and I just didn't know about it?
Well, it's kind of like home birth. I mean, births always have happened in the home, but it's I suppose there's a modern home funeral movement that is fairly new, I would say, over the last 25 or 30 years for some people, and all over the last 5 years for some of us. I mean, I became interested in this 5 years ago, so I'm relatively new to the movement. The Home Funeral Alliance formed 4 years ago, so it is rather new, although it never really went away.
Yes, that makes sense. Just as you mentioned, just with home birth, we just don't hear about it as often in the public. But I really do see this as a trend that could be taking off here because of the baby boomers and because of our interest in being environmentally friendly, but also just in having alternatives to the prescribed way that things are done.
Right.
Well,
I mean, as I talk to people of my generation, 50s and 60s, they get it and they're coming around to it and they're intrigued and they may or may not do it. And as I talk to young people, I do a lot of work with college-age students. As soon as I tell them what it's all about, they're like, they shake their head and they say, "Of course." Of course, it's right.
How interesting. How interesting. So our generation will be the pioneers of changing the process, but then our children will be the ones who will fully embrace it and probably, it's interesting to watch our customs and rituals change a bit, but it seems like we're finally moving back into a more family and person-friendly system by creating the home funeral, which is definitely a movement in the better direction as far as I'm concerned. Well, Merilynne, I also wanted to ask you about death cafes, because I know that you have been a facilitator of death cafes, and that's another movement that I'm really fascinated by that is taking place right now in our country. And so I wondered if you could just tell us what you know a little bit about that. I've never attended one, so I know very little, but I'd love to hear about it.
The Death Cafe movement is absolutely an amazing phenomenon. It started 2 years ago it initially started in Switzerland, spread to the UK, and then the first one that took place in the US was a year ago, July, and now they're taking place in cities all over the country, as well as in other parts of the Americas and in the world. People gather together and they drink tea and they eat cake and they talk about death. And it completely, when you're having it be a social occasion, it normalizes the conversation. People leave the Death Cafe feeling so uplifted and relieved that they finally were able to talk with somebody about death, because it's on all of our minds, but there's so many reasons why we can't talk about it, especially amongst our family members. So it's an amazing thing. I think the reason it's taken off so fast is that there's few opportunities to get together with people anymore and have a real conversation. So much is done virtually or on the internet, so people welcome the opportunity to have face-to-face conversation. And but by the same token, the internet has helped the spread of it, because you can quickly find out about it, where it's occurring, and how to get there. So I do all my, preparation for a desk cafe on the internet, and then people come and talk about it, and they love it. It's really growing.
Oh. So for each death cafe, is there usually a facilitator who's someone knowledgeable about death and dying?
The facilitator's role is very loose. They're not there to answer questions or to be any kind of authority on death and dying or anything like that. They're just there to start the conversation and help the flow of conversation, to set a few guidelines perhaps, and step out of the way. So people do the talking, and they share personal stories, and they ask questions of each other. But it's not like the kind of thing where you go to learn from one person. Everybody's learning from each other.
Oh, interesting. And so almost anyone could convene a death cafe if they had an interest. They could decide to set one up in their community.
If they have an interest in being a facilitator and a little bit of skill in that area, and they can advertise and they can get the word out and they can set up the location and that kind of thing, that they can do it.
Well, I love the idea that it's really about opening up to conversation. It's not necessarily about spreading education, though I could see that could happen, but it's a grassroots movement really of let's just talk to each other. Let's get over our stigmas and our fears and just sit down and talk.
Exactly. And you know how many people want to talk about death but can't with anybody. Time after time at the Death Cafe, people will share with me that somebody died a year or two ago and their family doesn't want to talk about it, so they feel they need a place to be able to just share the story. Or I've had people that work in the death care field, oncology nurses, who feel like they can't talk about it at work. And they're frustrated by that, and so they come and they share not particular stories, but they share their feelings about death. But the common thread is we recognize we're all going to die. So if we've done one thing with the Death Cafe movement, we've changed the terminology from if I die, I want, to when I die, I want.
Yes. Oh, I have to tell this little story right now because you'll appreciate it so much. But in April, I was in New York City at a publicity summit, and there were members of the media there, and I was talking with a woman who she secures guests for a television talk show, and wanted to know what I do. And I said, I work in hospice. I've written a book about the end of life, death and dying. I'm really trying to encourage our society to talk more about death and dying. And she said, the problem is that death and dying only affects a few people. It affects so few people in our society that we just don't have a big enough audience for it. And I was just stunned. But then I realized, you know what? That is the problem, that people are walking around in so much denial that she could actually say only a few people are touched by death and dying. Mm-hmm. And so it just shows how huge the problem is that we have to deal with. But I love the idea of the Death Cafe because you don't have to have a degree. You don't have to have worked in hospice. It's everyone bringing their own experience with death and dying together.
And people don't even see each other in any other venue. I've made friends at Death Cafe that I only see once a month at Death Cafe.
So once a Death Cafe starts, say, in your community, is there a commitment to meet every month, or is it? It's
variable. A lot of people, that's the way I chose to do it. I chose to have it at a consistent time so people could get used to it, that it's always going to take place on the third Saturday at 10 a.m. so that if they miss one, they can come another time, or, they always know it's going to take place. Other people have just done maybe for a year, or they've done one and they don't know if they're going to do another, or whatever. It's sporadic. They meet in different places. They schedule each one independently. So it depends on the facilitator, the person who chooses to lead it. There is a deathcafe.com website that has guidelines and certain basic, very simple, formative, things to keep in mind if you're doing a Death Cafe, that they ask everybody if they're going to use that name to adhere to.
And does that website as well could you register where your Death Cafe was being held or post it there?
Right. You do that on the website. You register where it is. and invite people to come. And you can choose if you want people to RSVP or not, if you're worried about space issues or if it's really growing and you might not have room for everybody, et cetera.
So it sounds like they're usually just held in a public place like a coffee shop or something where you don't have to, no one pays for a room or there's nothing.
Right. The idea is that it is supposed to be free. Sometimes people do use a space that has a small charge for using the space, so they ask for a donation to help cover that. But there's no charge for attending the Death Cafe per se. So coffee shops, church basements, libraries, bookstores, public, if there's a public meeting room of some kind in your community, that kind of thing.
Well, that's fascinating, and I can say, having written a book about death and dying, I've been invited in my own community a few times to book clubs who were reading my book and then having discussions about death and dying, and they invited me to come as a participant, and I saw how helpful it was. Every single person in the room had a story to tell and had something to share, and for many of them even said, this is the first time I've ever talked about this. And it pointed out to me how much we need it. It's almost as if we have a pressure cooker with pressure built up here, and the Death Cafe is like a valve that's allowing an opportunity to let off some of this, some of the pressure and the need that people have.
I agree with you totally. Yeah, that's a great way to describe it.
And the fact that it has taken off so much in just a little over a year, I think really speaks to the need for this movement as well. So what I see then, I have some hopefulness for the future, that there is change on the horizon. There's a demand for it, and it is coming from grassroots, from the people. And I have spoken, I've had a chance to interview Paul Malley, who is the director of Aging with Dignity, and they've created the 5 Wishes Advance Directive. But he was saying that entire movement, 5 Wishes, was grassroots. People wanted it and demanded it. And then eventually policy changed to make it a legal document, and doctors finally started listening and using it because people demanded it, the public demanded it. Well, I believe if we're going to change the funeral industry and even change our culture as far as talking about and dealing with death and dying, it will come from this very type of movement. Right. So how exciting for you that you're involved in two forward-thinking movements in terms of death and dying, and really helping to change the conversation in our country about how.
Well, it's really an honor and a privilege for me to be able to be with families and talking about people about such an important subject, and I stand in awe of the work that I see families do around death and dying. It's very encouraging and inspiring to me.
Well, Merilynne, if someone wanted to work with you as a consultant, how would they get in touch with you?
They can reach me through my website, which is afterdeathhomecare.com, or they can Google Home Funeral Michigan. They can find me through the homefuneralalliance.org website or the homefuneraldirectory.com website in Michigan. Lots of ways to reach me.
And do you work with people outside of the state of Michigan?
I have consulted with people on the phone from all over, so that's fine to contact me by email or phone.
Okay, and can you help people find out the regulations in their own state if they live in a different state? Do you have access to that information?
For that, I would direct them to funerals.org, which is a website that has printed out regulations which you can purchase for $5 for every state, and it's extremely helpful to know exactly what the regulations are. You still may need to pore over them and have some help with interpretation, but it's very clear. They've done a great job on funerals.org in doing that for everybody. That's the Funeral Consumers Alliance website.
Okay. Oh, that sounds That sounds very helpful then. So I'm going to include that on my list of resources here that I send out for all the listeners. And,
please do. I was remiss in not mentioning that earlier.
Yeah, I'm really impressed that there are so many resources. I had no idea. This is a bigger movement than I was aware.
You know, it's growing all the time. I mean, there's itsokaytodie.com and Order of the Good Death and Peaceful Crossings and Final Passages, and there's Seven Ponds organization in California that has a wonderful resource site. There's just so many options for people. There's options in the UK, in Canada, and in other countries.
Oh, I did want to ask you about that. Do you ever work with anyone from another country?
I myself have traveled a lot and looked at funeral practices in other countries. Every year I go to India and I go to Central America, so I've learned a lot personally, but I have not formally been involved in a funeral or a death in another country, no. And I haven't consulted with any family from another country.
But it does sound like in the more developed countries there may be similar movements going on.
I think so. Although we have somebody coming to our conference, our Home Funeral Alliance conference in October in Raleigh from Australia, who says there's nothing like this going on over there. So I haven't looked into that myself, but and I know there's a lot going on in the UK. The Sacred Dying is another movement that's spreading words about this, and I think people just look in their own area on the internet for resources and follow links on other websites so they'll get what they need in terms of information. But it's always helpful to have somebody to call personally, and there's a list of people on several of the websites I mentioned that are available that way.
Well, that's just fantastic, Merilynne. This has been so helpful and so informative, and I hope our listeners have had the courage to listen to our talk today, because it's such an important topic, and we really do need to consider not only how do we want to live the last days of our lives, but how would we like our goodbye to be, and how would we like our families to say goodbye and leave us behind. And so I think this is extremely important information. I thank you, Merilynne, for the work you're doing, both with home funerals and green burials and with the Death Cafe. And thank you so much for helping to change our world and change our culture for the better.
Thank you for all you do, Karen, and thank you for inviting me into the conversation. It's so important.
Well, you're so welcome, Merilynne, and I do hope if anyone is interested in more information that they will seek out your website at afterdeathhomecare.com and look into consulting with you, Merilynne, for more information and to just take advantage of this wonderful expertise that you have.
Thank you very much, Karen. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, Merilynne. And so goodbye to Merilynne, and goodbye to all of our listeners, and tune in for our next interview coming up shortly.